I recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hogan, for purposes of general debate, not to exceed a period of 15 minutes. Mr. Hogan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More than a century ago, in a time of great national trial, Abraham Lincoln told a troubled and bitterly divided nation, "We cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the last generation." Today, we're again faced with a national trial. The American people are troubled and divided again. And my colleagues on this committee know full well that we cannot escape history. That the decision we must jointly make will itself be tested and tried by our fellow citizens and by history itself. The magnitude of our mission is awesome. There's no way to understate its importance, nor to mistake its meaning. We have unsheathed the strongest weapon in the arsenal of congressional power. We personally, members of this committee, have felt its weight and have perceived its dangers. The framers of the Constitution, fearing an executive too strong to be contained and constrained from injustice or subject to reproof, arrayed the Congress with the power to bring the executive into account and into peril of removal for acts of treason, bribery, or other crimes of and misdemeanors. Now, the first responsibility facing members of this committee was to try to define what an impeachable offense is. The Constitution doesn't define it. The precedents, which are sparse, do not give us any real guidance as to what constitutes an impeachable offense. So each of us in our own conscience, in our own mind, in our own heart, after much study, had to decide for ourselves what constitutes an impeachable offense. Obviously, it must be something so grievous that it warrants the removal of the President of the United States from office. I don't agree with those that say impeachable offense is anything that Congress wants it to be, and I don't agree with those who say that it must be an indictable criminal offense. But somewhere in between is the standard against which we must measure the President's conduct. There are some who say that he should be impeached for the wrongdoing of his aides and associates. I don't concur in that. I think we must find personal wrongdoing on his part if we're going to justify his impeachment. The President was elected by an overwhelming mandate from the American people to serve as their President for 4 years. And we obviously must be very, very cautious as we attempt to overturn this mandate and the historic proportions that this deliberation have. After a member decides what to his mind constitutes an impeachable offense, he then had to decide what standard of proof he would use in trying to determine whether or not the President of the United States had committed an impeachable offense. Now, some have said that we're analogous to a grand jury, and a grand juror only need find probable cause that a criminal defendant had committed an offense in order to send the matter to trial. But because of the vast ramifications of this impeachment, I think we need to insist on a much higher standard. Our counsel recommended clear and convincing proof. That's really the standard for civil liability, that or preponderance of the evidence. And I think we need a higher standard than that when the question is removing the President of the United States from office. So I came down myself to the position that we can have no less a standard of proof than we insist on when a criminal trial is involved, where to deny an individual of his liberty, we insist that the case against him be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. And I say that we can insist on no less when the matter is of such overriding import as this impeachment proceeding. I started out with a presumption of innocence for the President because every citizen of this country is entitled to a presumption of innocence. And my fight for fairness on this committee is obvious to my 37 friends and colleagues who I think will corroborate that I was as outspoken as any member of this committee in calling our very fine staff to task when I thought they were demonstrating bias against the President, when I thought they were leaving from the record parts of the evidence which were exonerating of the President. I fought with the chairman and the majority, with some of my colleagues on this side, insisting that every element of fairness be given to the President, that his counsel should sit in on our deliberations and offer arguments and evidence and call witnesses. And my friend from Alabama mentioned that earlier, Mr. Flowers. But he will also have to confess that most of these concessions to fairness were made only after partisan dispute and debate, which is what our whole legislative process is about in the Congress. So I don't concede to anyone on this committee any position of fighting harder and stronger that the President get a fair hearing of the evidence. And while I do have some individual specific objections to isolated incidents of unfairness, I think on the whole the proceeding has been fair. Now, I'm a Republican. Party loyalty and personal affection and precedents of the past must fall, I think, before the arbiter of men's action, the law itself. No man, not even the President of the United States, is above the law. For our system of justice and our system of government to survive, we must pledge our highest allegiance to the strength of the law and not to the common frailties of men. Now, a few days ago, after having heard and read all the evidence and all the witnesses and the arguments by our own staff and the President's lawyer, I came to a conclusion. And I felt that the debates which we began last night were more or less pro forma, and I think they've so far indicated that. I feel that most of my colleagues before this debate began had made up their minds on the evidence, and I did. So I saw no reason to wait before announcing the way I felt and how I was going to vote. I read and reread and sifted and tested the mass of information, and then I came to my conclusion that Richard Nixon has, beyond a reasonable doubt, committed impeachable offenses which, in my judgment, are of sufficient magnitude that he should be removed from office. Now, that announcement was met with a great deal of criticism from friends, from government officials, from colleagues in Congress. I was accused of making a political decision. If I had decided to vote against impeachment, I venture to say that I would also have been criticized for making a political decision. One of the unfortunate things about being in politics is that everything you do is given evil or political motives. My friend from Alabama, Mr. Flowers, said that the decision that we make is one that we're going to have to live with the rest of our lives. And for anyone to think that this decision could be made on a political basis with so much at stake is something that I personally resent. It isn't easy for me to align myself against the President, to whom I gave my enthusiastic support in 3 presidential campaigns, on whose side I've stood in many a legislative battle, whose accomplishments in foreign and domestic affairs I've consistently applauded. But it's impossible for me to condone or ignore the long train of abuses to which he has subjected the presidency and the people of this country. The Constitution and my own oath of office demand that I bear true faith and allegiance to the principles of law and justice upon which this nation was founded. And I cannot in good conscience turn away from the evidence of evil that is to me so clear and compelling. My friend from Iowa, Mr. Maine, detailed some of the allegations against prior administrations. And I don't in any way question that. I agree with him that there was wrongdoing on the part of previous presidents, maybe all presidents. But I was not in a position where I had to take a stand, where I approve or disapprove of blatant wrongdoing. And I am in that position now. My friend from New Jersey, Mr. Sandman, said last night he wants to see direct proof, and some of my other friends on this side of the aisle have said the same thing. But I submit that what they're looking for is an arrow to the heart, and we do not find in the evidence an arrow to the heart. We find a virus that creeps up on you slowly and gradually until its obviousness is so overwhelming to you. Now, he's asked for direct proof. I think it's a mistake for any of us to begin looking for one sentence or one word or one document which compels us to vote for or against impeachment. It's like looking at a mosaic and going down and focusing in on one single tile in the mosaic and say, I see nothing wrong in that one little piece of this mosaic. We have to step back and we have to look at the whole picture. And when you look at the whole mosaic of the evidence that's come before us, to me, it's overwhelming beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's look at the President's own words. He uses the words cover up and cap on the bottle and the plan and containment, and he's concerned about what witnesses have said and what they will say. He's concerned about where the investigation is going. Now let's focus in on the thing that everybody talks about, the Hunt payment. Let's look at this as reasonable and prudent men. What did Mr. Hunt intend? His payments and demands had been relayed through his wife before her death. After his wife, he had to make them directly. So what did he do? He called Colson to make demands, and we have a transcript of what he said, and I want to quote. This is a long-haul thing, and the stakes are very, very high, and I thought that you'd want to know that this thing must not break apart for foolish reasons. We're protecting the guys who are really responsible, but at the same time, this is a two-way street. And as I said before, we think that now is the time when a move should be made, and surely the cheapest commodity available is money. And then he went and he talked to Colson's lawyer, Bittman. And to Bittman, he told him the same thing, that commitments were made, and he would blow the lid off the whole thing unless the money was paid to him. And then he went and saw O'Brien, the attorney for the committee to re-elect the president. And he said to him that he had to have $60,000 for legal fees and $75,000 for family support. He said if he didn't get it, he would reveal a number of seamy things that he had done for the White House, and if things didn't happen soon, he'd have to review his options. The man that was making those demands had over $200,000 in the bank that he had collected from his wife's insurance. So I asked my colleagues on the committee, what would the reasonable and prudent man assume that he had in mind? It's obvious he intended to blackmail the White House. Well, now let's go inside the White House and let's see what they say. They talk about this. Can we raise $1 million? You know, is this the way to go? Will there be other demands from them? How were the payments made in the past? These are the president's own words. He says, well, can we handle it through the Cuban committee the way we handled it before, indicating already knew about the previous payments made. These are his own words. And then he says, wasn't that handled through the Cuban committee? And John Dean says, well, no, not exactly. That's not the way it was. And the president says, well, that's the way it's going to have to be. Is this an urging to conceal the truth, or is it not? So the payment was made to Hunt. And it doesn't matter to me whether the president approved it before it was made. A conspirator, as all we lawyers know, can get in on a conspiracy at any point, even after the fact. So it's immaterial whether or not the point in time when he said, okay, I approve it, you pay it. The fact is, and the thing that's so appalling to me, is that the president, when this whole idea was suggested to him, didn't in righteous indignation rise up and say, get out of here, you're in the office of the President of the United States. How can you talk about blackmail and bribery and keeping witnesses silent? This is the presidency of the United States. And throw them out of his office and pick up the phone and call the Department of Justice and tell them there's an obstruction of justice going on. Someone's trying to buy the silence of a witness. But my president didn't do that. He sat there and he worked and worked to try to cover this thing up so it wouldn't come to light. And the FBI is conducting an investigation. So he says publicly, I want to cooperate with the investigation and the prosecution. But privately, all his words compel a contrary conclusion. He didn't cooperate with the investigation or the prosecution. And it's already been said by some that Henry Peterson called and he said initially in the conversation, well, it's not going to go any further. I know I have to keep this secret. He had no sooner hung up the phone when he was telling the defendants about whom this damaging information was made, what they could do to counteract the case that the prosecution had against him. Well, I could go on and on and on. I'm surprised that some of my colleagues, the telephone call from Pat Gray. Pat Gray was a man who did many things wrong. He was loyal to his leader. But at some point his conscience bothered him, and he wanted to tell the President of the United States that his aides were destroying the presidency.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Give the gentleman an opportunity to finish his sentence and his thought.
I appreciate the Chairman. That Pat Gray called the President to tell him that his aides were destroying the presidency. And instead of the President saying, well, give me more information about this, I want to know if my aides are doing anything wrong, I want to know. And Pat Gray says in his testimony, there was a perceptible pause, and the President said, Pat, you just continue to conduct your aggressive and thorough investigation. He didn't have to know because he already knew. And he consistently tried to cover up the evidence and obstruct justice. And as much as it pains me to say it, he should be impeached and removed from office.
Time of the gentleman has expired. I recognize the gentleman from